Before Alberto Fujimori became the man who shut down Peru's Congress and ruled through emergency power, he was an unlikely figure in the background of national life. The son of Japanese immigrants, a gifted student, and later a university professor who seemed built for lecture halls, not for one of Latin America's most brutal political storms. When people remember Fujimori now, they usually begin at the peak. At the tanks, the decrees, the victories over insurgency, the corruption scandal, the prison sentence. But the deeper story begins much earlier, with a child raised between identities and a man who learned, long before he entered politics, that survival often belongs to the one who adapts faster than everyone else. He was born in Lima in 1938 to parents who had immigrated from Japan and raised him as a Spanish-speaking Roman Catholic. That matters because Fujimori's life would always carry the tension of belonging and distance at the same time. He was fully Peruvian, yet visibly different from the coastal elite that had long dominated politics. He grew up not inside an old political dynasty, but outside it, studying, competing, and working his way forward through institutions rather than inheriting a ready-made platform. In that sense, the roots of his later appeal were already there. He could present himself as both insider and outsider, educated enough to govern, but distant enough to seem untouched by the failures of Peru's ruling class. He studied at the National Agrarian University, pursued graduate work abroad, and returned not as an activist or military man, but as an academic. He taught, administered, and eventually rose to become rector of the university. It was the kind of career that creates influence without spectacle. He was disciplined, technical, and methodical, traits that would later make him seem reassuring in a country exhausted by chaos. Peru in the late 20th century was under pressure from inflation, debt, insurgency, and institutional weakness. People were losing faith not just in leaders but in the state's ability to function. That is why Fujimori's rise cannot be understood as a random upset. He looked like the kind of man the political class had failed to notice until it was too late. He was not a charismatic ideologue from the old mold. He was a quieter operator, someone who could speak the language of work, order, and competence. In a country where conventional politicians looked compromised or detached, that difference had power. The central question of his life is not simply how he won power. It is how a professor who arrived as an outsider promising rescue became a ruler who concentrated power so completely that even his defenders and critics ended up describing him in the language of emergency. Fujimori did not rise through an old party machine. He rose through crisis. And once crisis lifted him, he learned how easily a nation in fear can accept a leader who promises results first and asks constitutional questions later. Fujimori's early life did not have the theatrical hardship of exile, prison, or revolution. What shaped him was something quieter: discipline, ambition, and the psychology of being underestimated. He grew up in a working and lower-middle-class environment, attended public schools, performed brilliantly, and built himself through merit. He was not born into the kind of privilege that turns authority into a birthright. He had to accumulate credentials. He became valedictorian, excelled in competitive examinations, and climbed through academic life with the patience of someone who trusted method more than glamour. That matters because the young Fujimori seems to have absorbed a lesson that would later define his politics. Institutions are useful when they lift you, but they are not sacred. Universities rewarded him. Professional life rewarded him. Expertise gave him standing. He learned how systems functioned from the inside, and he learned how to manage people, budgets, and competing interests long before he ever ran a campaign. By the time Peru met him as a politician, he had already spent years mastering bureaucracy without yet becoming a national figure. He had been training for control in quieter rooms. There was also something revealing in the way he entered public visibility. Before the presidency, he hosted a television program about agriculture and the environment. It was practical, managerial, and rooted in the image of a man concerned with the machinery of national life. That image, part professor, part technician, part problem solver, would become central to his appeal. Peru was entering one of its darkest periods. Hyperinflation was destroying purchasing power. Shining path violence had made fear normal. Traditional parties looked tired, compromised, and incapable of decisive action. A country in that condition does not always search for poetry. Often it searches for a mechanic. Fujimori's early formation helps explain why he could play that role so effectively. He was not built to be adored in the conventional style of old Latin American politics. He was built to appear useful. His language of work, honesty, and technology was not accidental. It translated his biography into a political promise. He was the efficient son of immigrants, the practical man from outside the elite, the trained mind who would fix what the professionals had failed to fix. But beneath that image was another instinct already taking shape. A technocratic mind can easily slide toward impatience. People who believe problems are solvable often become dangerous when institutions move too slowly for their taste. Fujimori's academic background made him look moderate, but it may also have prepared him to think in terms of systems to be overridden rather than traditions to be protected. He did not yet look authoritarian. He looked efficient. And in politics, efficiency is often the first mask power wears before it asks to be obeyed. When Alberto Fujimori entered the 1990 presidential race, he was still little known nationally. Peru's better-known figure was Mario Vargas Llosa, the celebrated novelist who represented elite confidence and a more recognizable path to power. Fujimori, by contrast, arrived with a new movement, Cambio 90, and the aura of a political nobody. Reuters later described him as a man who drove a tractor to campaign rallies. That image captured the magic of his rise. He did not look like the polished answer favored by established circles. He looked like a practical interruption. The country he addressed was close to breaking. Inflation had spiraled to devastating levels. Debt suffocated the economy. Insurgent violence from Shining Path and the Tupac Amaru revolutionary movement made daily life feel unstable and dangerous. In such a climate, conventional ideological arguments lose some of their power. People start rewarding whatever looks immediate, functional, and hard enough to survive. Fujimori understood that instinct. He did not offer literary grandeur. He offered work, honesty, technology, and the promise that he was not one of the men who had already failed. His upset victory over Vargas Llosa was more than an election result. It was a transfer of psychological trust. Peru had chosen the outsider professor over the famous writer because the country no longer wanted to be impressed. It wanted to be saved. That desire would shape everything that followed. Fujimori entered office without a strong party base, which in another context might have made him weak. Instead, it made him more willing to bypass the usual political game. He governed as a man who believed the scale of the crisis justified speed, harshness, and concentration of authority. He soon announced severe economic measures, what critics would call Fuji shock. Subsidies were cut, prices rose sharply, and the social pain was immediate. Yet the measures also helped tame hyperinflation and begin stabilizing the economy. At the same time, the insurgent threat remained deadly, and Peruvians judged the government not in calm constitutional terms, but through the lens of fear and survival. When legislatures hesitate and judges seem vulnerable while bombs, kidnappings, and assassinations continue, a decisive leader starts to look less like a danger and more like a remedy. That is the hinge of Fujimori's story. The outsider professor did not win power because Peru fell in love with moderation. He won because collapse made severity attractive. As president, he quickly learned that results could generate permission. Every improvement in inflation, every sign of restored order, every performance of direct contact with the poor and the provinces strengthened his image as a man acting while others argued. But already, the logic of emergency was widening. A president elected to rescue the state was beginning to act as though only he truly understood what rescue required. Crisis had elevated him. Success was teaching him that public gratitude can be converted into personal latitude. The outsider was no longer merely confronting Peru's breakdown. He was learning how national fear could be used to redraw the limits of rule itself. On April 5, 1992, Alberto Fujimori crossed the line that would define his place in history. Backed by the military, he suspended Congress, curtailed the judiciary, and imposed emergency rule in what became known as the autogolpe, the self-coup. To his critics, it was the moment Peru's elected president revealed himself as an autocrat. To many supporters, it was the moment he did what a weak political system had failed to do: break paralysis in the name of national survival. That split in perception is the key to understanding Fujimori's power. He did not rule despite crisis. He ruled by convincing millions that crisis made extraordinary rule reasonable. After the self-coup, a new constitution was drafted, institutions were reshaped, and Fujimori governed with far greater freedom. The capture of Shining Path leader Abimael Guzman in September 1992 gave him a massive political windfall. It appeared to confirm the central argument of his presidency. That uncompromising force worked. Later, his government also oversaw the dramatic 1997 rescue of hostages held by Tupac Amaru rebels at the Japanese ambassador's residence. These events deepened the image of Fujimori as the man who had done what Peru's fearful democracy could not: restore control. But restored control came with a price. Under Fujimori, anti-terrorism policy and intelligence power expanded in ways that critics and courts later described as abusive and criminal. His advisor Vladimiro Montesinos became the dark architect of a regime built on surveillance, manipulation, bribery, and secret operations. Peruvian courts later convicted Fujimori for human rights abuses connected to killings and kidnappings carried out by military death squads during his presidency. Those convictions matter because they shattered the defense that everything done in the 1990s belonged merely to the fog of war. The state had not simply fought violence. Parts of it had reproduced violence under official protection. Yet even this cannot be narrated simplistically if the story is to remain sharp. Fujimori was not a cartoon tyrant who ruled in the absence of public support. He remained popular with many Peruvians, especially those who associated him with stability, growth, and the weakening of insurgent terror. He privatized state companies, lowered tariffs, attracted investment, and helped lay foundations for a more stable economy than the one he inherited. That is why his legacy never settled cleanly into hero or villain. He gave many Peruvians results they could feel, and he asked them to accept the corrosion of democratic limits as the cost. This is where the professor-turned-president completed his transformation into something harder. He had come to power as an outsider promising rescue. Now he stood above the institutions he once claimed merely to fix. Congress, courts, constitution, intelligence services, media influence, each became something to manage, bend, or neutralize. The language of emergency became the permanent grammar of his rule. What began as a national response to collapse had become a system organized around one man's authority and one regime's willingness to decide that legality mattered only when it helped them win. Fujimori's collapse came not because Peru suddenly forgot what he had delivered, but because the machinery of his rule became too visible to deny. In 2000, after maneuvering to secure a controversial third term despite constitutional limits, his government entered its final breakdown. The decisive blow came through the Vladavideos, recordings that showed Vladimiro Montesinos bribing politicians, business figures, and media executives. The videos made public what many suspected. This was not merely a tough government using harsh methods in hard times. It was a system of managed corruption held together by money, fear, and covert power. Fujimori fled to Japan, a country whose citizenship he also held, and sent his resignation by fax. Peru's legislature rejected it and instead removed him from office. The image is unforgettable because it captures the distance between the self-made ruler and the institutions he had hollowed out. A man who once seemed inseparable from the fate of the Republic was now departing it remotely, not with tragic grandeur, but with the bureaucratic coldness of a document. The outsider who had promised national rescue had become the exiled symbol of a state bent around one presidency and then left to reckon with the damage. Yet even in exile, the story did not end. In 2005, Fujimori traveled to Chile, apparently hoping to stage a political return. Instead, he was arrested, extradited to Peru in 2007, and tried. Peruvian courts later convicted him on corruption charges and in 2009 sentenced him to 25 years in prison for human rights abuses tied to killings and kidnappings carried out by a military death squad during his government. Reuters reported after his death in 2024 that he had spent some 16 years in prison before being released on humanitarian grounds. Those legal outcomes fixed something history had long been arguing over, whether Fujimori should be remembered as the savior of Peru, the destroyer of its democratic safeguards, or both. The truth is that his life resists simple moral packaging. He did help stabilize an economy in crisis. He did preside over decisive blows against insurgent groups that had terrorized Peru. He also ruled with authoritarian methods, oversaw a corrupt apparatus, and was convicted for grave abuses. That combination is exactly why he remains such a powerful subject. Fujimori forces a harder question than most political biographies do. What happens when a leader really does produce results, but does so by teaching a nation to accept concentrated power as normal? In the end, Alberto Fujimori's story is not just about Peru. It is about the seduction of efficacy in frightened societies. He rose because democratic weakness made decisive action look virtuous. He endured because success made excess easier to excuse. He fell because a regime built on emergency eventually exposed how much of its strength depended on secrecy and manipulation. The professor who once seemed too technical, too obscure, too outside the old order had turned himself into the center of the state, and then into the cautionary tale it could never fully escape. That is why his arc feels so cinematic and so unsettling. He began as the immigrant son who mastered institutions. He became the outsider professor who promised rescue. He rose as the fixer of a nation in panic. He ruled as the architect of emergency power. And he ended as a convicted former president whose legacy still divides Peru between gratitude and outrage. Fujimori did not simply use crisis to win office. He turned crisis into a method of rule, and that method transformed him from an unlikely savior into one of Latin America's most contested political figures.